Let's talk more about the U.S.-Venezuela relationship. We're joined now by Patrick Duddy, former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela, Duke University's Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies director. Now, he served as the U.S. ambassador to Venezuela from 2007 to 2010. Both President Bush and President Obama's representative, the last in person, on the ground ambassador the U.S. had. Patrick Duddy, good morning. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Ambassador, Maduro clearly wants sanctions lifted. It is very apparent from that conversation. My question to you is, does the change of administration in Washington enhance or leave the same his chances of that happening?
Well, it's important to understand that the position of the United States over the last decade in particular has been very clear. The U.S. wants to see a restoration of democracy, the rule of law, and human rights respected on the ground. And those sanctions have been applied and then increased gradually over time as the regime headed by Mr. Maduro has become more authoritarian. The one signal change I've seen so far in the Biden administration is the decision to grant temporary protected status to Venezuelan refugees presently in the United States. And of course, the refugee problem precipitated by the authoritarian character of the regime is extraordinarily serious. There are between 5.6 and 6 million Venezuelan refugees now in the U.S. and in neighboring countries to Venezuela.
Ambassador, do you think President Biden is listening?
I think that President Biden, the team at the National Security Council and the State Department are all looking for signs that the Venezuelan regime is prepared to be partners in the process of restoring democracy. I think that our administration is likely to be disappointed on that front because the Maduro regime to date has given no indication that they're prepared to risk their position in national elections. Indeed, when the opposition won 2/3 of the Congress in 2015, the regime immediately moved to impugn some of those elected and to make changes in their system to preclude any possibility that they would lose future elections.
Ambassador, what is your assessment of the Venezuelan economy? How much of what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the degradation of that economy is down to sanctions, and how much of it is down to simple poor management?
Oh, it's the situation on the ground is dismal, but it is largely a consequence of the incompetence and corruption of the Venezuelan authorities. The U.S. didn't apply sectoral sanctions really until I think 2018, 2019, and it's worth noting that prior to that, the sanctions that we applied were against individuals, not against either the oil industry or other industries. Nevertheless, the contraction of the economy, the drop off in terms of oil production, had already begun to snowball. Was precipitous.
Ambassador, do you have a rough back of the envelope calculation as to what kind of capital needs to come into Venezuela a year to help stem inflation and help growth? Like, how many billions of dollars would we need to see?
I don't have a single figure, but let me offer you a couple of other points. They've been suffering from hyperinflation for some years now. In May, it was estimated by, I think, Reuters that inflation was over 28%. In April, nearly 25%. Year to date, over 2,000%. And the current minimum monthly wage is $3. Now, the reason for much of the collapse of the economic sector is not sanctions. It's that for years, the Venezuelans diverted income from their gas and oil industry to other programs, including arms purchases. And they neglected to make the kind of capital investments that would have kept that sector competitive.
What is your assessment of when the current situation changes? Is this status quo going to persist? Do you think that we are going to see a shift in tone from the Maduro administration? The indications are that the Biden administration kind of doesn't want to act first. It wants to see a shift happening in Venezuela before it takes any action. How likely is that?
Well, I don't think it's likely in the very near term. And I think there is some implicit recognition of that around the world, as pretty significant amounts of money are now being pledged in the form of either loans or grants to help with the refugee populations in Colombia, Ecuador, et cetera. I think the problem for the Biden administration is what to do about the humanitarian crisis. On the one hand, they see Maduro as not a credible partner in relieving circumstances on the ground in a country which has had food shortages, medical shortages, and where it's very difficult to calculate the impact of the COVID. That said, the U.S. clearly wants to help, but the government has been severely criticized by the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, and the High Commission has recently suggested that at least some of the human rights violations perpetrated by the regime constitute crimes against humanity. So my sense is the Biden administration wants to avoid partnering with such an unsavory regime. At the same time, it is looking for ways to relieve the humanitarian crisis. And I think it's worth adding at this point that when you have the numbers that we have seen flowing out of Venezuela, these are Venezuelans who don't necessarily have political ambitions, but 5.6 to 6 million refugees. This constitutes a real burden on the entire region, on Colombia, on Ecuador, on Peru, et cetera. So it's a pretty grim situation. But it's also clear that neither the region nor the United States wishes to try and solve the problem with military force.